Hello and welcome to Theater Operations Unleashed, the monthly show that explores the ins and outs of theater operations, management, facilities, and design. I'm your host, Raymond Kent. In each episode, we will be focusing on management, operations, design, trends, and best practices in the performing arts. I hope to bring you both insights from my 4 decades in the industry, as well as engaging conversations with theater professionals about the challenges and rewards of their work. We'll also cover a wide range of topics from budgeting and scheduling to marketing and audience development, theater technology, and many other related topics. Whether you're a theater maker yourself or just interested in the industry, I hope you'll find this podcast informative and inspiring. So sit back, relax, or lean in, and let's dive into the world of theater. I'm here with Christina Kruise. Christina is a business operations and fundraising specialist with DLR Group. Her natural curiosity and lifelong love of the arts led Christina to a career focused on development and planning for cultural facilities, working to ensure that these spaces are equitable, accessible, inclusive, and representative of the communities in which they exist. An experienced practitioner, Christina has a deep understanding of the forces and trends at work in the arts and culture sector, and how these elements impact the choices being made for a facility. So welcome, Christina.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking your time today to discuss this. As you and I had touched base before about you coming on and doing this for me, the focus of this is really on community engagement and operations and management and mission and vision. And I know that's a lot of what you tend to focus on in your role at DLR Group and just in general within the arts. So I'd love to have a little conversation with you about that, as the arts are still kind of looking for ways to climb out of the pandemic. What I'd love for you to talk a little bit about is the importance of the reevaluation of an arts organization in the market, particularly theater, and how that aligns to programming with evolved expectations of audience in a post-pandemic world. So can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think theaters are in a really tough place, in part because of the structure of going to the theater, the way going to the theater works. It's typically in the evening, unless it's a matinee. It typically is asking for audiences to be quiet and to sit in a seat in the dark. And those things preclude a lot of people from coming, parents for one. Um, and there isn't a lot of opportunity for folks to just drop in or kind of come as and when they please. And I think that's an advantage that museums have that performing arts venues don't. Museums have a lot more flexibility. Galleries have a lot more flexibility in terms of how people can engage with them. So I think generally theater facilities and theater institutions and organizations, that's a disadvantage. And so thinking about how do you create more of those points of access? And I think we see some institutions do this, like Lincoln Center has lobbies that people can just come in and get coffee or get a drink or whatever and things like that. But that's not necessarily engaging with the content that's there. I'm not really answering your question, but I think I just say that to say that I think theaters have to think about their spaces and points of access a little differently than some other cultural spaces and institutions. Generally, though, I think to me, art and culture and art spaces are all about community, and how they are communal spaces. In my mind, they are equal to libraries and parks and the YMCA in creating a third space for community to be. And I think to be successful at that, you have to have a really good understanding of who your community is. And I think that's one of the challenges with arts nonprofits generally and arts organizations generally is that having that understanding means spending time in community, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a big commitment. So your job can't, in a lot of ways, the job of a nonprofit operator is not just a job. It's not a 9 to 5. It's really a vocation where you are kind of living and breathing that life. And I think that's a big ask for folks in the nonprofit sector. And I think it's not necessarily fair in a lot of ways. But I do think that to be really vibrant and successful as a cultural institution in a community, you do have to have a certain level of intimacy and understanding with that community in order to understand what their interests are and what their worries are and what helps them, what are their needs. So so that you can offer those things and create those places. And I think we saw some of that during the pandemic when cultural organizations and institutions were suddenly there was a more realization, I think, around all of the things that these places do that aren't just art and culture. That, they're feeding meals, they're providing restrooms, they're um, offering other services that are essentials to some communities to get by.
So that's a very interesting perspective, and I agree with so much of that. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, however, on just the economic impact. I mean, these are, to your point, cornerstones of communities, right? They are gathering places. And historically, if you look at the history of theater, going all the way back to even the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians and everything else, they were always about gathering and community. Um, and they were the social centers, as they still are in very ways, very much like you point out a library is, right? But there's also quite a difference between a library, which is a social center, and an arts organization that has a significant give and take financially to a community that it's embedded in. And I know this is a lot of what you focus on as well. Is how does the community financially support that organization, and then how does that organization's um, contribution to that community impact the financial stability or financial growth of that community?
Yeah, so I one thing I think about a lot is I don't think arts organizations, and I don't, this is going to sound like a blanket statement, and I don't mean it to sound like a blanket statement because I know that there are those out there that are doing a really good job of this. But I think arts organizations struggle sometimes with talking about the things that they do, and they focus on the artistic merit and the quality of the work they're producing. And I think in the design field, we do a similar thing when we're talking about projects. We focus on the square footage and the materials and, whatever innovation we brought to the design, but we forget about the other things that are being done. So with arts organizations, sometimes they forget to talk about how many community meetings they hold in a year, or how many students walk into the door, or um, how many hours of free community programming they provided. And I think that's selling themselves short because I think that's where you start to um, capture. I think that kind of storytelling helps capture new donors that you might not have and helps capture bigger gifts, but also helps increase the perceived value of an organization in a community. I talked to one organization, for example, who was telling me about they were doing, I think, a renovation on their building, and it was a big renovation project. And they were looking for a campaign chair, and they went to this one person who was not a big arts supporter. And he said, I don't care about the arts, flat out told them that. But then they started to talk about the community impact that this organization had. And the more they talked about that, this potential donor, potential campaign chair said, you know what, I don't care about the arts, but I do care about my community. And for that reason, I will be your chair and I will contribute to this campaign. And he was their biggest cheerleader. He got up before every performance and talked about why this theater company was the place you should be putting your money. And so I think some of the economic piece is around not shying away from talking about the impacts and finding all of the ways that you can talk about the impacts. And sometimes that requires talking to folks that aren't in the world of the arts. Maybe it's talking to the educators in your community to find what's resonating with them, or talking to the politicians to find what's resonating with them. And then really examining your practice and your operations, and finding all of those places that you're providing value.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a messaging issue,
Yeah.
right? Totally a messaging issue. And I know you and I have had conversations about this before, just even as a career opportunity, right? Uh, how do we reach out? I know there's some movement within the arts to reach out even further back to even middle school, to guidance counselors, to parents, to show them the value of a career in the arts, right? And that's an economic driver there. Um, but I also think that, like this person you were mentioning, who is not a supporter of the arts but became their biggest champion, there are so many things that people have at their fingertips now between Netflix and their cell phone and YouTube and Facebook and all, and what, pick a social media, right? TikTok, that they can turn to for entertainment. I think it's really trying to demonstrate the value that arts contributes to their life beyond just purely an art form or form of entertainment. So how do you perceive um, opportunities for better messaging that maybe folks that would listen to this would might get some ideas or some thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's really tough. And I think it's super interesting because if you look, I don't spend a lot of time on things like TikTok or Instagram, or social media generally, but I think there's so much creativity that happens in those spaces. And folks are folks are engaging in arts and culture at really high rates in those spaces. So it's mostly a matter of how do you I think it's more a question of how do you transfer some of that activity that's going on there into a physical, social, public space, and how do you translate that interest into that reality?
Well, we did see some of that during the pandemic, right? When
Yeah.
so many theaters shut their doors because we were in the middle of a global health crisis and they couldn't invite audiences to their space. They turned to social media and Zoom performances and things like that that really helped them stay in a way connected to their audiences. But I know that so many of them felt that there was a failure at that point because they would put out a Zoom performance, but nobody would log in. And I think the running question is why, right? We talk to clients all the time that are interested in putting in cameras or not interested in putting in cameras because, oh, we did that during the pandemic and nobody watched it. So I'm curious, what is that transition? How from your view, how do you convert that or use that, leverage that to bring people within the fold of the organization and into their seats to see shows?
Yeah, I think we're still figuring that out. And in a way, like some of it somehow it needs to be like a teaser. Like you have to be able to get something out of the virtual that you're like, so you feel so compelled to see it in real life or to continue the exploration. And honestly, I wonder how much of it comes back to the idea of curiosity and exploration. Like I've been thinking about curiosity in general a lot, just in I get just generally, and like what makes somebody more curious than someone else? And what is that thing that if I read something, I am so good at getting into rabbit holes over the silliest things. And others like don't have that compulsion to like learn more about whatever it is that they're
Sure.
reading about.
Sure.
And I think some of that is the case with culture. It's like if somebody hears a I don't know, some concerto in a TikTok video that they think is the most beautiful thing in the world. How do you get them to take that experience and like, I need to learn more about this and find other concertos and other composers? And then that gets them to a symphony. What does that process look like? I don't know exactly, but I think that's part of it is like, and maybe it's setting up pathways for that. Like, if you could map out that process, what are all of the stepping stones essentially that you need to make that possible for somebody? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that I don't think I agree with that. I don't think there's one right answer, right? I think each situation is going to be unique. Each organization is going to be unique in terms of what works for them. What I'm wondering about is, about the content, about what types of performances you're doing. Like you're mentioning concerto. As a theater, if I'm doing, a tried and true Tennessee Williams play or Ibsen or Shakespeare or something that's well known as an avenue to reach out to audiences, or if I'm doing a new cutting edge work, you know, we're involved in a number of organizations that do that. They only produce cutting edge work, and that's really hard to get people to take a bite of that apple, anyways.
Mhm.
So, are there new cutting edge ways to leverage technology like a TikTok or whatever the next flavor is going to be that aligns with their mission and their vision to create that cutting edge, you know, um, type of art compared to somebody who might want to play it a little bit more safe because maybe they're in a more conservative, part of the country, right?
Mhm.
I was having a conversation with an artistic director who's in a very conservative part of town, and she was telling me about how um, she would never do a new play there. Like the audience wants to see the tried and true Hello Dolly, Legally Blonde is a little too risque for them kind of thing. But it's interesting that you have to read the dynamics of that. But is that really the audience? How do you grow new audiences with that mentality? Because those audiences are eventually going to disappear,
Mhm.
and you want to bring in newer audiences that maybe have a different lens on life, maybe aren't as conservative. So to me, I think there's a fine balance, but because there are so many ways to engage uh, for entertainment value, and educational value and social value within arts, as you point out. I could watch Netflix and be entertained, and there's so much great content being produced out there. But how do you then take that and get people to also remember that theater has this sense of immediacy and personalization and connection on a very real, tangible level that sitting on your couch watching some movie doesn't have, right?
Yeah. I
So
don't I
I
part of
Go
me
ahead.
is wondering if I mean, I feel like I'm still thinking from the model of traditional theater and traditional theater operations. And I wonder if that's not part of the problem. So like, do you people still are looking for experiences. I
Yeah.
think regardless of whatever it is we're talking about, people are still looking for experiences. They still want to be out and they want to be socializing. So if you like what if we make theater smaller, less make it smaller spaces, smaller shows, smaller number of shows in a year, or I don't know, like what it I somehow I think what we're seeing and I think what we're in the process of, but haven't come out to the other side yet and may not for a little bit still, is that the the process and the model is changing, but what it's changing into is not yet clear.
That takes me to the one of the questions that I had given you to think about, with that article that was recently in the New York Times that was discussing about how many theaters are experiencing major declines in seasonal subscriptions, right? There are more and more single ticket sales, less and less subscribers, and that unpredictability in revenue is also impacting donors, how their donors are perceiving that organization, right? And the health of the organization and their willingness to give financial support and everything. So you're talking about, trying to attract people to lead donor campaigns. If you do shrink the shows and shrink the number of shows and maybe shrink the venues and things like that, does that maybe give a perception to that community that maybe the theater is not doing so well? And that's why, because we've seen a number of theaters, uh, as you and I know, saying, "Oh, we're canceling our season or we're shutting our doors permanently." And these are some major heavy hitters, right? Mark
Yeah.
Taper Forum and folks like that, right? So I find it really interesting that from an impact on an organization's business planning and market studies and programming and everything else, going that direction and sort of changing that model, that's going to be some growing pains there, don't you think?
Yeah. And I think though too, I mean, donors are also changing too. So I think there's a generation of donors who would look at a theater who says, you know what, we're not going to have a brick and mortar space anymore. We're going to be an itinerant organization, would say, oh, that organization might not be doing very well. But I think
Long
there,
Wharf Theater is a
yeah,
great example of
exactly.
that, right?
Yeah. But I think there is a younger group of donors who would say, wow, they look at all of this stuff that they're now doing in community that's causing all of these positive impacts and outcomes. I want to put my money there. And so I think there's a generational shift in philanthropy that a dwindling subscription or a significant change in operations or the place that you're operating from would not be seen as a liability, but rather a positive thing that an organization is doing.
Yeah, I know, within the particularly LORT structure, right? These big regional theaters that were, for the most part, spawned out of the 60s and 70s. Um, some of them much older. Cleveland Playhouse is a great example of that, over 100 years old. Um, but you have to look at that model where some of them have gotten quite large with quite palatial facilities, huge operating costs, huge staff costs. And is that audience still there for them? If you look at, and I see where you're talking about how the donor base might change because of that. Do they still view organizations like those as worthy of their dollars, or are there better opportunities now for, I know you and I don't like to use the phrase arts deserts, but they're
Yeah.
hidden arts, right? Art is always happening, but maybe they're just not as prominent or out in the public, but it's still happening. It might be a very small little niche thing. And there's been some people calling for a movement for these donors, instead of funding organizations, funding the artists directly,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And that's in direct contrast to how these organized institutions function and what they need and rely on to stay viable within those communities. And if those larger organizations that operate that way, if they're to collapse, what do they become? And then does that leave a vacuum, and what fills that vacuum?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I just keep thinking about sort of the democratization of the arts. And there is a part of me that believes that we should all have a creative practice. And maybe we shouldn't place certain arts on a pedestal and um, make it more commercial and a commodity, I guess. And I know that like you do have to do that at the same time. Um, but sometimes I just wonder, like, what if arts and culture was just such a normal part of all of our lives that we didn't really think twice about it? We just did it we all had some sort of expression. Um,
See, I think what you're saying there, I think we already have that, but I think the focus is different. And we already have arts and culture in our daily lives, but it's so ubiquitous to us that we don't even pay attention to it,
that's fair.
right? You know, like
Hmm.
I watch my 20-year-old son constantly pick up his phone and watch some video online or something, you know, and it's artistic in its own right. But the notion of going to a theater, which is also artistic, just in a different way, is not something that he outwardly seeks. He'll go see a show if, you know, if I ask him to, but it's not something that he himself would say, I want to go do that. So I don't know if I think that maybe people aren't necessarily putting arts and culture in the forefront of their mind. I think we're surrounded by it, right? Every product we pick up from our iPhones or our laptops or even the television sets or things we buy for our kitchen have an artistic flair to it, you know, a
Yeah.
design to it, right? Buildings, you know, we work in architecture, you know, buildings that we design are artistic in their own way, but is that a perceived artistic endeavor, or are we talking about active, conscious artistic endeavors that people have to make a conscious decision to go and attend and consume in a short amount of time that has, like I was saying before, that sort of live immediacy that only theater or other live art forms can provide?
Yeah. And I guess I do see what you're saying, that we're surrounded by art and culture constantly. And I do agree with that. And I think where I'm coming from is more of a place of all of us having a creative practice for ourselves of some kind, where each, we have an outlet through which to create. And you could say that we all do that with work, and we do in a way. We're all outputting something. But um, sometimes when I think about art and culture, it's more about if we all had access to a creative process for ourselves, what would that world look like?
Hmm.
And if we all practiced it regularly, which is a different thing. Which I think I strayed from your question, which I forgot what the original question was. Um,
Well, I was talking about, you know, the sort of hidden arts, and
yeah.
would we see the donor base maybe tapping into that and funding more individual artists or individual endeavors? There's also another push against that as well, because you still have to have, in some people's views, a venue or a place to perform the art. You still have to deal with the cost of costumes and scenery and lighting and sound. And even though I make the argument that those are extra, even though I'm, you know, a designer in the arts and theater, you know, because to me you need a great story, somebody to tell the story, and somebody to listen. And
Hmm.
that's, to me, world-class theater. Everything else helps support that, is supportive of that. The venue, the costumes, the lights, the sound, scenery, all that. Um, but if you fund the artists to be able to create that art in conjunction with other artists, does that serve the community better than giving the money over to an institution who then manages and fosters that creativity?
I think that is what people think. I think that some funders think the answer to that is yes. And in part, I think the reason we're seeing this trend is because funders were looking to institutions to spread funding and curate shows that were more equitable and representative of community. They trusted institutions to do that job and be successful at it. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is a lot of talk about how none of these institutions are really that representative of the communities they're in or the population as a whole. That being said, I'm not sure that funding individual artists will achieve that goal unless the mechanisms through which funds are distributed are really examined, and that we're making sure that they are accessible and to many people and equitable and in their distribution.
With that thought in mind, it may be a two-parter here, but the question I would have for you is my experience of decades of working in this industry. Often people that are put in arts leadership positions are building the plane as they fly it, right? They have no business training. They have no managerial training. They're the last person standing, and now they're in charge of not only the artistic side, but the business side. So they have no business acumen. And now you're handing them money and telling them they need to be good stewards of those dollars. Some of them do it very well. Some of them actually do. But also, if you look at the donor base, those donors oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes come from a business world, right? They've done very well for themselves in business, um, been successful, have the capital to donate, and they have a business mindset of, I'm going to give you X amount of dollars for you to execute the business of producing art. And I trust that you're going to do well with this. But I often wonder if there isn't a disconnect between what the expectations are from that donor who's donating. Not saying that giving it to an individual artist is going to be any better, but you know what I'm saying? Like, if I were a bajillionaire and I donated $10 million to an arts organization and said, here, I want you to produce great art and use this money wisely, but I give it to somebody who's never run a theater before in their life, but now they're the brand new executive director or artistic director or whatever else. And people who tend to be on the boards also tend to have business mindsets. Is there a disconnect in the judicious use of those funds based on expectations of the people who are running the arts organizations versus the people who are contributing to those organizations? And so within your work of creating business plans and looking at the economic impact and looking at community engagement and all of the other things that you do, how do you align that disconnect?
That's a good question. I think it's really challenging. And I think it comes down to some of it comes down to transparency, and some of it comes down to uh, your board and having board, the right people on your board and at your board, right? These are people who understand the mission of the organization, um, and are in support of that mission and are making their decisions through the framework of that mission and the organization's values. But I think some of it also comes from being out in community. That I I'm going to use the word community engagement, and I don't mean that in the sense of like doing town halls and workshops with community. I mean it with in the sense of being engaged with community. And if you are engaged in community, if you understand who and what your community is, and you're operating in a way that is authentic to that community, then it shouldn't be a question in the mind of your donors. That disconnect shouldn't exist. They should know what you're doing and what you're trying to do and achieve. And that should be the reason that they are giving to you, is to support you in that pursuit. So I think that's maybe sometimes where the disconnect happens, is if you are, and I think it's hard if I think about like an organization here in New York, like I'm just going to say Signature Theater because I know it's over in the city and kind of like it's in a neighborhood, but it's not like a place where you're going to go out and see 30 of your nearest and dearest, right? Like it still is in the
Mhm.
middle of Manhattan. So how do you define community in that sense? And I think if you're in if you're operating in an environment where the idea of community is somewhat loose and more nebulous, um, it could be really hard to do that, to make those clear connections and have that level of transparency. And then I think maybe that's where the board plays a really essential role, because they are those um, protectors of the organization, and they need to ensure that the organization is operating in a way that is true to its mission and in alignment with its mission. Um, and so maybe in that sense, that's where they're able to kind of make sure those disconnects aren't happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think that for me, it always starts with maybe a reevaluation of the mission and vision of that organization, and to really make sure everybody is in agreement, right, and alignment with it, and um, so that you're all rowing the same direction. And I some of the challenges that I've heard about and know about, that's often where I see the fall down is, the board might think their mission and vision is one thing because they see it on a piece of paper, but what the organization is actually doing is something completely different. And because the interpretation of those words on that piece of paper that identifies their mission, and they get the mission confused with the vision, which are
Hmm.
two really different things. And so they say, oh, mission and vision, our mission and vision is this. Well, they're really two separate things. And one might have a firmer grasp on the mission of the organization, but the artistic managerial staff needs to hold that vision of how to achieve that mission and be able to lead the board down that way and have support of the board. And I often find, again, in my experience, that's where the headbutting happens. Again, I have a friend of mine who is an artistic director, and her board, who's predominantly local business people, come from a profit mindset, and this is a nonprofit organization. And I understand what she's trying to do with the organization as it aligns with their vision and their mission, which she is very clear on. But even though it is a nonprofit and people hear nonprofit, their reflexive nature of being in the business community is to drive profitability and success that way. And that's how they gauge it, right? Revenue is great. And this is where I often see a collision when you have a nonprofit uh, arts center, performing arts center that is partnered with a for-profit entity, right? That might be doing some programming within their facility. So there might be a combination of a for-profit entity that maybe they're bringing in music groups, right? And there's a music series, and that for-profit entity is in charge of that, and they're a promoter, and they do a good job, and they take their cut, and the venue gets revenue towards their, which helps to fund their sort of more nonprofit elements of it, and the board sees the for-profit arts organization driving revenues and profitability, and sees that, well, the nonprofit should be doing that as well, without really understanding that sometimes in the nonprofit side of things, it's a lost leader. You might expend money to do an artistic endeavor that you're never going to turn a phrase in theater, make the nut.
Hmm.
And that's often looked at in a disgruntled way. I mean, we've done it certainly in architecture, where we'll have lost leader projects where we partner with an arts organization because we believe in their mission and vision, and they really can benefit from our years of experience and our expertise to help stand them up, knowing that at a future date we might have better opportunity with them, or the people that work there might go off to other places that are capable of paying us a full fee or whatever else, right? So to me, that's where I see the disconnect between the donor class, the board leadership, the artistic leadership, and the mission and vision, coupled with a lack of maybe some business acumen, or a disconnect in vocabulary, or people just going off in different directions. So when I look at some of the things that we do as within our practice, and when we go and we engage, Christina Kruise to say, hey, we're going to do this study for you, and Christina is wonderful, and she's going to do all these great things. Talk a little bit about what exactly you do at DLR Group and how that intersects with what we've been talking about.
Yeah, so I do a few different things at DLR Group. The big thing is doing market assessments for our arts and cultural clients. Sometimes these are we're pursuing the work through an RFP process. Sometimes there are clients we have who embarked on a design journey and have gotten stuck or haven't made much progress. Um, And so it's helping them evaluate their concepts based on the community that they're in. And it's really about understanding who's living and working in a place and who's visiting a place. And what does that tell us about the types of arts spaces they might be interested in visiting and the types of arts programs they might be interested in attending. The other piece of that is also understanding the opportunities for partnership. So when I'm working in a community, I'm often meeting with, the folks you would expect to be user groups, like the theater troops and the dance schools and the community bands and the orchestra. But I'm also meeting with church leaders and other nonprofit organizations and the school districts and the local university if there is one, and the economic development director and the chamber of commerce, and anybody who might have some sort of perspective on the community and what the needs there are, or that might have need for space. And so I think in thinking about how, that kind of goes back to the idea of thinking about art spaces as community spaces, and it's finding all the ways that an art space can tap into a community through all of these various users and potential users. The other thing I do is helping clients develop business plans for their projects. And then the third hat is around fundraising strategy and support. And so sometimes that's helping a client with their case statement. Sometimes it's building gift tables. Sometimes it's looking for and applying for grant funds. The fundraising piece has been really variable, but a lot of it I think comes back to storytelling and finding the story that is authentic and true, and also the most compelling story for a potential donor pool.
Okay. And so looking to wrap up here, what are some parting thoughts that you might have on how to maybe better align um, sort of that community engagement side of things with uh, the need to really help arts organizations, theater organizations like this? If somebody was operating a theater organization, why would they want to engage someone like you? Why would they, how would they go about thinking about who do I reach out to? Who do I call? How do I even know that I need this help?
Yeah, that's the tricky thing. You don't usually know you need it until you need it.
Right, right.
But I think so. Why would you want to hire someone like me? I think it's kind of like is it Plato's cave? I don't know what the right sort of analogy is, but you can only know so much. You can only see yourself from so many perspectives, right? So having an outsider come in and think about you and your organization and the opportunities for your organization from a different perspective can be really useful. It can help you think about partnerships in different ways. It can help you think about your space and space utilization in different ways. It can help you think about how you are or not engaging with your community in different ways. So I think that's really important. Um, what was the second part of your question?
Well, why would they, so how would they know, right? Like what's going to say to somebody, hey, maybe I really need to find somebody outside, some outside perspective here. Because I completely agree with you that people often don't know that they need help till it's too late,
Yeah.
right? And I think we saw quite a lot of that during the pandemic with so many arts organizations completely folding because they were just sort of humming along, and then pandemic hit, and all of a sudden they realized they weren't as good a shape as they thought.
Yeah.
And maybe if they had uh, reached out to gain some outside perspective, not as a, and I know it can come across as, oh, I'm doing a terrible job, right? At managing my venue. I don't want people to think I'm doing a terrible job. Why would I want to do that? But I often think of it almost like a therapist, right?
Yeah.
How people benefit from going to a counselor or to a therapist or something just to gain some outside perspective as life goes on. But I also know there's also a lot of stigma around that, right?
Mhm.
I don't want to go to a mental health professional because then people will think that I'm weak or whatever it is, right? Um, but I think from my side, it's about communication and about education. But I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a healthy thing to do. I think it's like going to the doctor every year for your checkup. I mean, every organization should be doing some sort of annual uh, examination, some sort of annual review, annual check-in, and strategic planning. Um, but in addition to that, I don't think it hurts to every other year, every few years, say, okay, are we actually doing the things that we said that we would do? And also, let's look at all of our ticket buyer data, or let's look at all of our attendance data and see, like, how are we actually doing? What are the zip codes where people are coming from? Is this the audience we thought we were attracting? Or is it wildly different? Are we attracting all of the audience that we could be attracting? And if not, what might that tell us about how maybe we need to change what we're doing? I don't, I think we all should get comfortable with the idea of being a bit more self-reflective, whether
Right.
it's us
Right.
as
But
individuals or the work that we do or what have you. I
yeah,
just think it's part of the health of your organization. And as a board director, as a executive director, it is your responsibility to make sure that that organization is healthy.
completely agree. But I think oftentimes people get into an echo chamber,
Yeah.
right? They almost surround themselves with it's kind of like the emperor has no clothes, right? They almost surround themselves with people that are going to either bury their head in the sand, not really say, maybe we're not doing that so well. And if they're not doing that so well, they don't want to let the outside world know, right? So the thought of bringing an outside perspective in to really look at that with a clear set of eyes um, is often challenging to them, right? So if you look at a lot of what we talked about today in terms of community engagement and some of the struggles and challenges that we see the current state of theaters and so many who are struggling, maybe they could have used, like I was saying before, used a little bit of outside perspective, almost like a therapist. And so to your point, maybe it's every other year, every 3 years, they do invite somebody else to come in and really look at and examine how they're doing to confirm or help steer them in a better direction that uh, continues their longevity and success and sustainability in a better way than the same board people and the same executive leadership that all sit around the table every year, year after year after year after year, looking at the data, but being blind to what the data is really telling them,
Hmm.
right? Because they don't want to see it or they don't know how to see it,
Yeah.
right? So those are sort of my parting thoughts. I really appreciate, again, you taking the time today to chat with me about this. We're going to have lots more conversations here once a month. Thank you so much, Christina.
Thanks, Ray.
Thanks for taking the time today to listening to Theater Operations Unleashed. We hope to see you next month.